I'm Jessica Wilbur, and this is my family history. My father's name is Thomas Wilbur. He was born on June 22, 1961. His side of the family originates from Scotland and Ireland. My fourth great-grandpa, James Bryson, was born on August 26, 1802, in Braehead, Scotland. He married Margaret Scott in 1824, and they moved to Greenock, Scotland, shortly after. James and Margaret departed from Greenock, Scotland, and arrived in New York on August 8, 1835. In 19th century Scotland, immigration was the result of both force and persuasion. Until about 1955, a number of the immigrants from the Highlands were actually forced to leave their land because of evictions. In the lowlands, the decision to move abroad was nearly always the outcome of the desire to improve one's living standard. The Brysons were a very poor Scottish family who most likely faced unemployment. And because they departed from the lowlands, they most likely left Scotland in the hope that they would make a better living in America. Luckily, James and Margaret Bryson left Scotland before the Great Potato Famine in Ireland during the 1940s. The Irish were willing to work for lower wages than the Scottish when they arrived in America, making work difficult to find for Scottish immigrants who arrived in the 1840s. However, education was highly widespread in Scotland, so most Scottish immigrants were literate and were able to make a decent living in America. Scottish immigrants also had a fair chance of finding fellow Scots when they arrived, and frequently obtained assistance from some of the Scottish societies that had been formed there to assist newcomers, such as the Scots Charitable Society of Boston. Another fourth great-grandpa on my dad's side, William Edward Wright, immigrated from Ireland. He was born in 1793, and he married Tropina Triphook in March of 1823. They departed from Cork, Ireland, and arrived in New York on April 6, 1852. The Wrights faced the devastating potato famine in Ireland during the 1840s. During this time, most of Ireland's population left Ireland for another country or died of cholera or malnutrition. Once they arrived in New York, the Wrights would have faced an abundant amount of nativism. Irish immigrants had a terrible time finding jobs and faced brutal discrimination. Employers even put out signs that read, "No Irish need apply." The Irish remained poor and lived in the slums of big cities. The Irish in the North were equivalent to the slaves in the South in social standing. And that wraps up my dad's side of the family. My mother's side of the family came from Ireland and Scandinavia. My great-great-grandfather, Edwin Ferdinand Skepstrom, was born in Stockholm, Sweden on November 4, 1889. The mass exodus of some 1.3 million Swedes to the United States between 1850 and 1950, often young men and women, during the 19th and early 20th centuries, was due to the economic and social circumstances in Sweden. A strong population growth in Sweden increased the pressure on a society that was fundamentally agricultural in nature, and moving to North America provided the Swedish immigrants with economic opportunity not available in the homeland. My ancestors left during the midst of this population crisis. Edwin departed from Liverpool, England when he was 22 and arrived in America on February 24, 1912. Swedish immigrants from the late 19th century settled mainly in Illinois and Minnesota. Both states grew steadily, filling with Swedish immigrants, including my great-great-grandfather Edwin, who settled in Illinois shortly after he arrived in America. By 1910, more than 100,000 Swedish Americans resided in Chicago, which meant that about 10% of all Swedish Americans lived there. At the turn of the century, Chicago was the second largest Swedish city in the world. Only Stockholm had more Swedish inhabitants than Chicago. My fourth great-grandfather, Edward Ennis, came to America from Ireland. Edward was born on July 23, 1818, in Westmeath, Ireland. In the 1840s, a terrible potato famine hit Ireland, killing most of the population. In the midst of this chaos and tragedy, my ancestors left for America. Edward departed from Liverpool, England, and arrived in New York on March 28, 1846. Once he arrived in New York, he would have been living in poverty, fighting for low-wage jobs. Nativism was prominent in America at this time, so he would have faced harsh discrimination, especially from nativist groups such as the Know Nothing Party. There were even nativism riots, such as the Philadelphia riot in 1844. Most Irish men and women filled the jails and lived in the slums of the big cities. The Irish were hated due to their religion, and they were seen as disposable, so they worked in most dangerous low-wage jobs. My ancestors came from Scotland, Ireland, and Norway. They immigrated during very difficult and popular times in history, and their journeys will always be remembered.